You won't believe what happened when the HOA security tried to stop my delivery trucks. Picture this: a peaceful neighborhood, a couple of delivery trucks rolling in, and an HOA that thinks they can control who gets access to the community. But what they didn't know is that I don't just supply ordinary goods. Oh no, I supply critical supplies to the National Guard. That's right. While they were busy waving their little clipboards and making demands, they had no idea who they were messing with. It all started when my trucks, carrying essential equipment, were blocked at the entrance. The guards were adamant about following rules that, as I later found out, didn't even exist. I tried explaining, but that only seemed to make things worse. They were convinced they had the power to stop deliveries, but there was a bigger picture they completely missed. What happened next? Well, let's just say the situation escalated fast, and it wasn't in their favor. The real kicker: I'm pretty sure they'll regret ever doubting who I work with. Stick around, because you won't want to miss what went down next. Trust me, it's a twist you won't see coming at first. I thought it was just a minor misunderstanding. After all, I've had deliveries in and out of this neighborhood for years. My company handles a range of goods, from construction supplies to military-grade equipment. But this particular day, the security guard who approached me seemed determined to make a stand. He wasn't just doing his job, he was acting like he owned the place. He started quoting bylaws that didn't exist and insisting that my trucks couldn't be parked on the street. I tried to explain, telling him about the sensitive nature of the delivery, but he wasn't having it. Instead, he began calling his supervisor. As the minutes ticked by, I could see the tension building. More residents started to gather around, watching the scene unfold. It was getting uncomfortable, to say the least. What really bugged me was how they treated my drivers. They're good people, just doing their job, and here they were being publicly berated by some security guard who clearly had no idea what he was dealing with. I could feel the frustration rising, but I didn't want to make a scene. That's when I got a call that turned everything upside down. Someone from the National Guard was on the line, and their tone was urgent. What had started as a small hiccup was about to explode into something way bigger. The call from the National Guard caught me off guard. They were asking why the delivery was being delayed, and I tried to explain the situation, but they weren't happy. The urgency in their voices was clear, and that's when I realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a simple delivery. These supplies were critical for an operation that couldn't be postponed, not even for a moment. I told the officer on the phone I'd handle it, but as I hung up, the weight of it all started to settle in. Meanwhile, the security guard was still standing his ground, and now he had backup. A couple of other guards showed up, and they started talking about calling the police. That's when things really started to escalate. I didn't want to go down that road, but I also couldn't let them stand in the way of this delivery. I knew I needed to handle this without causing a scene, but every minute that ticked by made things worse. As I stepped out of the truck to try and defuse the situation, I could feel the eyes of the entire neighborhood on me. Some residents were openly siding with the guards, murmuring about rules and safety. I could tell they didn't understand the bigger picture, and that irritated me more than I'd like to admit. What these people didn't know was that the National Guard wasn't just getting basic supplies, they were getting equipment that could potentially save lives in a crisis. And yet, here I was, fighting to get through an HOA security checkpoint. The frustration was building. I couldn't afford to waste any more time, but I also didn't want to alienate myself from the community or make an enemy of the guards. The standoff was beginning to feel like it was spiraling out of control. The longer this dragged on, the more I could feel my patience thinning. I tried to stay calm, but with every passing minute, the pressure mounted. The guards were still adamant about enforcing these rules that felt more like personal power trips than anything official. I glanced over at my drivers, who were visibly frustrated and getting antsy. They were only following orders, but they were stuck in this limbo between me and security. It was getting worse by the second. I could see some residents starting to look more concerned. A few of them were even taking out their phones, probably to record what they thought was going to be some dramatic confrontation. The pressure of being watched, of knowing that this could turn into something bigger if I didn't resolve it soon, was overwhelming. My mind raced back to the phone call from the National Guard. They needed these supplies, right now. If I didn't find a way to break through this impasse, I'd be the one responsible for a critical delay. And that wasn't an option. Then, just as I was about to say something, a police car pulled up at the entrance of the neighborhood. It felt like the world had stopped. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The guards quickly started talking to the officer, but my heart was pounding. Was this it? Was this the point where everything would come crashing down? The officer's eyes shifted between me and the guards, and for a brief moment, I thought he might side with them. But there was still that lingering doubt. What if he wasn't in the mood to deal with any of this? What if he just decided to throw his hands up and walk away? This wasn't just about getting supplies through anymore. It was about whether I'd lose everything I'd worked for. The police officer stepped out of the car slowly, taking in the scene before him. The two guards were still talking rapidly, explaining their side of the story, clearly trying to paint me as the troublemaker. I could feel my heart racing. This was the moment where everything could go either way. If the officer sided with the HOA, this could blow up in a way I couldn't come back from. But as he walked toward me, I noticed something strange in his expression. It wasn't the usual "I'm just doing my job" look. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Before I could even process it, the officer stopped in front of me and asked, "Are you the supplier for the National Guard?" My stomach dropped. How could he know that? I hadn't mentioned anything to anyone except the guard itself. His next words threw me for a loop. "I served with them last year. You don't want to be causing problems with their shipments." I blinked in disbelief. What were the odds that this officer had a connection to the exact operation I was supporting? But before I could say anything, the security guards looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. The officer turned to them, his voice low but firm. "You do realize you're holding up critical supplies, right?" The guards were visibly rattled now, but just as I thought things might be moving in my favor, a new figure appeared at the entrance. Another SUV, this time with tinted windows. The driver stepped out, and I immediately recognized the man as someone I'd seen at HOA meetings before. He wasn't just any resident, he was one of the board members. And judging by the look on his face, I knew he wasn't here to help. The situation was about to take another unexpected turn, and I had no idea if I was ready for what was coming next. The board member's presence sent a chill through the air. He strode toward us with an air of authority, scanning the scene with a look that told me he wasn't interested in any kind of compromise. The officer turned toward him, eyebrows raised. "We've got a situation here, sir. These trucks are carrying critical supplies for the National Guard. Blocking them could be a serious problem." The board member, however, didn't seem fazed. "I'm aware of that," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "But rules are rules. These trucks don't have permission to park here, and I'm not about to let the HOA be liable for any disruptions. You're creating a mess for no reason." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. How could someone be so indifferent to the urgency of the situation? The National Guard wasn't just any operation. I could sense the tension rising again, and for a brief moment, it seemed like we were at an impasse. The officer looked between the board member and me, clearly torn. Then, just as I was about to speak up again, something unexpected happened. The officer suddenly looked back at the board member and without warning stepped in front of me. "You know," he said, his voice stern, "I'm actually the one who authorized this delivery. I'm the one who approved the special access for these trucks." The board member froze, his face drained of color as the officer handed him a small piece of paper, an official document. The officer turned to me and smiled, finally breaking the tension. "You didn't think we'd forget, did you? I've been working with the National Guard for years. We've got your back." I stood there stunned. The entire time, the officer had been playing both sides, making sure that this delivery would go through, despite the board member's interference. It was a brilliant move. But just as I thought the nightmare was finally over, the board member took a step back, muttered something under his breath, and made a call. A few seconds later, his phone buzzed, and he hung up with a tight-lipped grin. "We'll see about that," he said cryptically. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I could tell this was far from over. Despite the victory, something told me the HOA wasn't going to back down so easily. As I watched the officer and the board member exchange final words, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last chapter in this battle. The board member's cryptic words hung in the air, but thankfully, they didn't lead to any immediate drama. After a tense few moments, he muttered something about escalating it further, but it was clear that the power dynamics had shifted. The officer, now in full control of the situation, motioned for the trucks to move forward. As the deliveries finally began, I couldn't help but feel a rush of relief. The supplies were on their way, the National Guard would get what they needed, and the unnecessary roadblock had been cleared. The board member's attempt to flex his power had failed, and for once, it felt like justice had prevailed, even in the most unlikely of places. But as the trucks rolled out, I knew this story wasn't over. The HOA, with all its rules and regulations, still had a few tricks up its sleeve. The officer had helped today, but what would happen if this situation repeated itself? I made a mental note to be ready for round 2. For now, though, the crisis was averted. The National Guard had their equipment, the trucks were on their way, and I could finally breathe. Sometimes, it's not about winning, it's about standing your ground and knowing when to call in the right support.